Good afternoon. Welcome to part 3 of Leading in a Crisis. I'm Walker Armstrong, Executive Director of Pilot Mountain Baptist Association. It's great to be with you again. This week we're going to be looking at how to leverage your strengths. Last week we looked at living according to your convictions. And what we discovered about that, your core convictions, was that everybody has values. Everybody has aspirational values, things that they resonate with, things that are important to them. But we looked at core convictions being a little bit different, being values on steroids, that you lead from your core convictions the things that are most important to you about life, your core beliefs, your core ideals, the way you're trying to operate as a person and as a leader. We looked at the diagnostic question of, are you hypocritical or are you trustworthy? And we saw that hypocritical leaders say one thing and do another. They're manipulative, they're superficial, they're self-serving. And over time, what eventually happens is that kind of leadership style is exposed versus a trustworthy leader. And a trustworthy leader is not a perfect person, but they're an honest person. And they seek to live consistently according to their core convictions. We said that the foundational value that fulfills and feeds that capability on the path of influence is integrity. And we defined last week integrity as a commitment to consistently live according to your core convictions, regardless of cost or circumstantial pressure. That you're determined to live a certain way, and you're going to do that no matter what it costs you. That's a person of integrity. So this week we're going to be looking at living and leveraging according to your strengths, leveraging your strengths. How do you do that on the path of influence and developing your character? Well, I think defining strengths is very important. I look at it as the gifts, abilities, talents, and temperament that we've been given by God that can be developed over time. They're capabilities that we can grow and expand as leaders. It's almost like the raw tools or materials that God can give us that we can invest in and enhance. The diagnostic question we ask ourselves when we're trying to determine if we're really effectively leveraging our strengths is this: am I aimless or am I engaged as a leader? Now we can relate to both. To be aimless means to be going through the routine, doing things simply out of sheer duty. And as a result, we become apathetic and disengaged and oftentimes feeling like what we do doesn't really matter. Most of us have lived life in this pace at times. We've had jobs that we had to have in the interim to pay bills and take care of needs, and there's nothing wrong with that. As an individual, you know that a lot of life is about routine, about doing hard things, even about boring things in some ways. The problem is not with that. The problem really is when we as leaders and individuals only do things out of routine, only do things out of duty, and thus we lose our motivation eventually over time. Now, when we're engaged versus aimless, we're more focused, and when you're more focused, you're more productive. The foundational value that supports being fully engaged is the idea of passion. How do I define passion? I think passion is the positive energy we bring to bear in a situation, which gives us the capability we need to accomplish important things and the resilience to follow through. Without passion, we run out of gas. Without passion, there's a lot of unmet potential left on the table. So how do we fuel passion? I think there are 3 ways we can look at today that are very helpful. The first is this: by engaging our spiritual gifts. If we're followers of Christ, we've been given the promise that every single believer has at least one gift given to them by God. There are many passages in Scripture that teach this. One in particular is found in Romans 12, verses 6 through 8. Let me read that to you. Having gifts that differ according to the grace given to us, let us use them. If prophecy, in proportion to our faith. If service, in our serving. The one who teaches, in his teaching. The one who exhorts, in his exhortation. The one who contributes in generosity. The one who leads with zeal. the one who does acts of mercy with cheerfulness. Now, this passage teaches us many things. First and foremost, that these gifts are given by grace. Just as we're saved by grace, not by works or merit that we can bring to the table, we're also gifted by grace. We're enabled by grace. And those grace enable us to do things that are of benefit to other people. The second thing it teaches us is that the only way you can prove that you're gifted is by actually doing it. Now, this infers some kind of level of experimentation. You're going to have to try certain things to see if you're gifted by God in them. And you'll also have affirmation from other believers that they see you gifted in this way. So all these things God does in and through us are based on His grace and based on His purposes for our life to have the maximum possible influence and impact. A second way we can dive into our passions and fuel our passions further is to see our natural abilities as another layer of God's design for our lives. What do I mean by that? Well, the first instance in the scriptures about God anointed, God ordained, God enabled abilities is found in the book of Exodus, the second book of the Bible. And in that context, it's teaching how God enabled certain artisans to help build and upfit the tabernacle. It talks about God, His Spirit, giving people abilities in carpentry, in sewing, in metallurgy. We would call these trades today in our 21st century. But back in the book of Exodus, we find that God enabled people to do His will by giving them certain gifts. Modern researchers kind of reflect this idea about the different types of capabilities that we have. There's a guy named Howard Gardner that is a famous researcher, professor, and author from Harvard University that in the mid-'80s postulated a theory called multiple intelligences. If you're an educator in elementary, middle school, high school, you've probably already read about this. But it was quite a revolutionary idea back in the mid-'80s because educators and developmental psychologists only acknowledge one type of intelligence, which we would call IQ or cognitive capabilities. And based on Gardner's groundbreaking research, he began to kind of give the idea that there are multiple types of intelligence. He defined intelligence as the biopsychological potential to process information that can be activated in a social setting to solve problems or create products that are of value in a culture. At first he started with 5 and expanded to 8, and here his list: musical rhythmic, visual spatial, verbal linguistic, logical mathematical, bodily kinesthetic, interpersonal, intrapersonal, and naturalistic. So what Gardner's saying is that we have certain innate, and he would not necessarily describe them as God-given, but he would say that they are hardwired within your brain for potential, probably since birth, to be able to naturally do things at a high level of competency. It's this idea that you've seen people who are natural athletes, or you see people who can come up with the right words at the right time. You see people who could do computations in math without any real explanation of how they're able to do that. And so when we talk about strengths, we're talking about abilities that you have, and we would say as Christians that the God of creation and the God of redemption are one and the same God. The God who gives spiritual gifts is the same God who gives natural capabilities and abilities. And instead of normalizing this or making it just simply ordinary abilities, we ought to see it as channels through which God can pour out His strength through us to benefit others. Really, in the kingdom of God and the economy of God, there's no such thing as just ordinary capabilities. They're all gifted by God to make a difference in other people's lives. So we see we can dive into and develop our passions through spiritual, through seeing our natural abilities as an extension of God's plan for our lives. And thirdly, we can dive into our passions and expand them and feed, seeing how our personalities are for unique influence. We often call this and refer to it as temperament tests there that have been very effective and very useful. BTI, DISC, others, the Big Five. One that's very popular these days is called Enneagram. And the idea is that we have certain proclivities or leanings, our temperaments to make us, who we are. For example, you might be extroverted or introverted. You might think in concrete terms or theoretical terms. You might be spontaneous or very structured. You might be highly empathic or very dynamic and directive. These are just some measurements that, again, researchers think are kind of hardwired into your brain that we develop over time. There are many aspects of our personalities that are somewhat fixed. Think of the Apostle Paul, for example. In the early part of the book of Acts, we find him as a person called Saul. He was a member of the Sanhedrin, a Pharisee of Pharisees, and his sole purpose in life early on was to destroy the church. And he went about it in a very relentless, methodical, and systematic fashion. In Acts chapter 8, he's on his way to Damascus to persecute Christians, and he has an encounter with Jesus Christ that forever revolutionizes his life, and Saul eventually goes by the name of Paul. Now, was his personality totally and utterly erased? No, it wasn't. It was just sanctified. So that same strength of relentlessness and systematic and methodical ways of approaching life were just extended into him being enabled to write about a third of the New Testament and plant churches all over the ancient world. You see, God uses our temperament to do his bidding and do his purposes. The key for us about this is to accept who we are, to see our strengths and weaknesses as part of God's plan. The truth is, with your personality, you've probably already experienced this, that some people get you and some people don't. Some people like you and some people won't. Some people work really well with you and some people have a harder time doing that. What does that tell us? That every leader and every individual has their limits. That's why we need other people. And this brings us back to the diagnostic question, are we aimless or are we engaged? So if we're not leveraging our strengths, we will be disengaged. And chances are that will often lead to not only ineffectiveness, but burnout for leaders. Again, there's no question that life is about doing hard stuff. The do is about accepting the boring parts of your life. But if you never plug into your passions, you're never going to be effective. So finally, how do we leverage our strengths during a crisis? Well, we've already said that the crisis of COVID-19 brings three kind of factors into all of our lives. Number one is unpredictability. We've never experienced anything like this before. We don't have a benchmark to compare to. So it's really hard to say what's going to happen next. Secondly, we get conflicting information. One day, we think that we're curbing the tide of the disease. Another day, we're not. One day, we think that hundreds of thousands of people are unfortunately going to perish. And the other day, we have a number that's much less than that. So we don't know what to believe. So there's unpredictability, there's conflicting information. And thirdly, there's just a personal dynamic of feeling overwhelmed and overmatched for the task. All of us at some time or another have felt these three things. So how does that apply to leveraging strengths? Well, I think in a crisis like this, we need to simplify and focus not on what we can't do, but what we can do. God has gifted us with spiritual gifts, with abilities, with temperaments, with the tools we need to make a positive difference in this world. God is not surprised by this situation. He's not overwhelmed by it. And if God is not surprised, then we can infer that we can lean on him and ask him for guidance and how we can use the capabilities he's given us for the greater good. It's important to remember that not only do we have limits, but we have God-given strengths. And we ought to think about 1 to 3 things, to be very simple, 1 to 3 things that we can do for other people that can make a difference. For example, if you're gifted in finances, you might be able to help individuals in your family, in your community, neighborhood, in your church, kind of rethink their budget during times of diminished financial capability. Maybe you can help your church or your Christian organization in that way. What if you're an encourager? You're really gifted in relational skills. Maybe you can just simply call people up and encourage them and pray with them over the phone. Let's say that you're a carpenter and you've got really great woodworking skills. Maybe you can build things for people that they can use, like maybe a garden box that they can think about planting vegetables with. Maybe you're gifted in teaching, and so you can think about how to teach about stress and anxiety during a time like this. There are all kinds of multiple applications, but the bottom line for us is doing 1 to 2 to 3 things to benefit other people. Not focusing on kind of being and having some kind of grandiose solution, because that doesn't exist. That's beyond our pay grade. But we can, each of us, do constructive things to make a difference. And when it comes to leadership, by providing that example to people, we enable them and influence them about thinking how they can do the same. Because leadership is about 2 things. It's about character and it's about competence. And when we talk about character, it's this path of influence. And this path of influence today involves leveraging your strengths. And as a leader, what that enables you to do is show people what they can do using the gifts and capabilities God has given them in such a time as this. I hope this has been a source of encouragement to you today. If you'd like further information about our tools that we use to teach this leadership loop, you can email me at walker@pmba.org. I look forward to hearing from you.